Whitefield was born in 1714 in England, dies in 1770 in the colonies on the eve of the Revolution. It was said that more people would have known his name in the colonies than any other name except King George III.
The Great Awakening is this series of revivals that took place along the Atlantic seaboard in the middle decades of the 18th century. People talk about such figures as Jonathan Edwards, for example, or the man that was known as the Grand Itinerant, George Whitefield, an Anglican priest, comes to the American colonies, and he's enormously successful. He had been trained in the London theater, and he comes into a context where there's no theatrical tradition. So he stands up in these village greens or on Society Hill in Philadelphia, and he uses his stentorian voice and dramatic pauses in order to attract audiences. And the colonists were, again, with no understanding of theater, the colonists were just transfixed.
You had Ben Franklin actually helping to promote George Whitefield's sermons. Franklin's newspapers had basically what we would now consider round-the-clock coverage of Whitefield's speeches and travels. And it helped to create this spirit of opposition to the kind of privileged, inherited power structures, in that case, the religious power structures. But it spilled over into a sentiment of challenging the political structures too.
Contemporaries said he could bring tears to your eyes simply by saying Mesopotamia. He was that gifted as an orator. So he, along with these other itinerant preachers, go from place to place in the Great Awakening.
Whitefield was an evangelical and a small d Democrat, although his basic message was about the power of Christ and personal relationship with God. Both explicitly and implicitly, he was taking on the Church of England. And for most Americans, the Church of England and the Crown of England were connected. You were attacking both simultaneously. You were attacking British power. And Whitefield, as a primary advocate of, in effect, breaking down some of the privileged institutions, was an inspirational figure.
There is this kind of elaborate core of myth that surrounds the dying Whitefield.
When he died and was buried in Newburyport, Massachusetts, evangelicals began fairly early on visiting his grave and began actually going into the grave, which is an astonishing truth. In some cases, bribing the sexton there, who would give them access to the grave. And they would often then steal away with relics.
One of the weirdest moments in the American Revolution was Benedict Arnold was leading an expedition up to Canada to try to win over the Canadians, or if that didn't work, conquer them. And they had the idea that to inspire the troops, they would stop off at the grave of George Whitefield. They opened up the crypt and took a piece of his clothing and took it with them to Canada as a relic, a source of inspiration. And that was a sign that they thought that this was a holy enterprise.
And going forward then into the 1820s and 30s, evangelical preachers are going to stop off frequently at that location and come away with things, including, in a couple of cases, people allegedly take bones. One of these is spirited across the Atlantic and then later returned to the United States, and much made in the American press about joy over the fact that it eventually returned to American soil. Today, among the artifacts that exist is, putatively at least, a bit of his thumb that was kept as a relic. And it's remarkable because the next person, culturally, historically, chronologically, that Americans would treat with that same level, and then ultimately perhaps even a greater level of veneration, was George Washington. And I think there's a lot going on there, but weirdly, it even extends to something people noticed as they became enamored of George Washington, which was they actually liked the fact that they were both named George. As they grasped for some sort of rational basis for uniting in memory their favorite patriot and their favorite preacher. Of course, George III was a George too, more inconveniently, I would suggest. And you can actually find cases where people say, imagine a veteran of the American Revolution who, if born in the right time period, might have lived physically, through the right years, so that in principle, there might be someone out there who has shaken both the hand of George Whitefield and the hand of George Washington. Handshaking itself being increasingly part of the new physical political culture. As so often happens, things go even further with George Washington. And you find all sorts of accounts by evangelical preachers of pilgrimages, their own word in many cases, that they're going to take to Mount Vernon after Washington dies in 1799, and extending all the way up into the mid-19th century, particularly, where they are going to talk in great detail about what it was like to stand at Washington's tomb. And in many cases, they're going to draw out similarities and differences in some instances, but it's going to put them in mind also of what it would be like to be at Christ's tomb at the time of his interment prior to the resurrection.